My name is Iris Twain, and I turned 18 yesterday. During my birthday party, my father quietly pulled me aside and told me that after the celebration I'd need to sign a few papers for Uncle Wade. He called it just routine paperwork. I smiled, acted calm, and nodded like I agreed. Then I slipped into the kitchen, opened my laptop, and moved every dollar my grandparents had left me into an irreversible trust before anyone could touch it. The next morning, my parents and younger sister discovered the truth. The lake cabin, the savings accounts, the investments, everything was locked behind legal protection they had no power over. My father looked sick. My uncle, who had already promised the property to a developer, immediately started calling attorneys. Before I explain how everything exploded after that, make sure to like the video and subscribe. And leave your city and local time in the comments. I genuinely enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now let me take you back 6 years. The summer I turned 12, Grandpa Harold picked me up in his rusty truck and drove me out to Cedar Lake. Hidden behind rows of pine trees sat the old cabin. The porch leaned slightly to one side. The screen door squeaked every time it opened. The entire place smelled like smoke from the fireplace, old paperbacks, and pine wood warmed by sunlight. "Grab that side," Grandpa told me while lifting a broken fence rail. I grabbed it without complaining. We spent the morning replacing damaged fence posts. Grandpa taught me how to press my thumb against wood to see if it was rotten. "If it sinks in," he said, "the wood's finished." Inside, Grandma Vivian had iced tea and sandwiches waiting for us on the kitchen table Grandpa built with his own hands years earlier. That evening, we sat on the porch while the sunset turned the lake gold. "One day this cabin stays in the family," Grandpa told me softly. "But family isn't always blood, Iris. Family is the people who actually show up." At 12 years old, I thought he was simply being sentimental. He wasn't. After that summer, I spent nearly every weekend at Cedar Lake. Grandpa showed me how to patch leaks, inspect shingles, and clean the gutters. Grandma taught me how to organize bookshelves by color because she believed it made the cabin feel happier. Little by little, they taught me every corner of that place like they were passing down a secret. Back home in Ridgemont, things always felt colder. Our house looked normal from the outside, but warmth never lived there. My younger sister Kelsey had the bigger bedroom with lavender walls and expensive furniture. My room still had stained carpet from the previous owners. One evening during dinner, Dad brought up the cabin. "That place is losing value," he said while cutting steak. "We should sell it and invest the money." Mom nodded immediately. "That would make more sense." Grandpa said the cabin stays in the family, I reminded them quietly. Dad laughed, but not kindly. It was the type of laugh adults use when dismissing children. "You were 12, Iris." He was just talking. Then the conversation shifted to Kelsey's debate trophy. Nobody mentioned the science fair I'd won 2 weeks earlier. Later that night, I noticed a glossy brochure sitting on the kitchen counter. Ridgeline Development. Lakefront Properties. Premium Investment Opportunities. Someone had written a phone number on the corner. That was the first moment I realized certain people were already looking at my grandparents' home and seeing dollar signs instead of memories. 2 years later, Grandpa Harold died. I was 14. At the funeral, I saw Dad and Uncle Wade whispering near the dessert table. Wade carried a folder tucked beneath his arm. "We should handle this before probate becomes difficult," he muttered quietly. They were discussing the cabin during Grandpa's funeral. I stayed silent because I was only 14 and had no idea Grandpa had already prepared for exactly this situation. 2 years passed. Grandma Vivian became sick in March and passed away in June. During my final visit with her, she squeezed my hand tightly. "The cabin belongs to you, Iris," she whispered weakly. "Don't let them take it." "I promise," I told her. She squeezed my hand once more before closing her eyes. After the funeral, Dad sat at the kitchen table looking strangely relieved. "Now we can finally sort out the property," he said. That same night, I overheard him talking to Wade in the garage. "Let's move quickly," Dad said. Standing in the hallway holding a glass of water, I suddenly understood something awful. To me, Grandma's death felt heartbreaking. To them, it felt profitable. I didn't cry that night. I made a decision instead. Between 16 and 18, the cabin quietly became my rebellion. Every weekend, I drove to Cedar Lake in an old Honda I bought with babysitting money. I repaired torn screens, cleaned the porch, fixed damaged weather stripping, and swept pine needles from the roof. At home, the language slowly changed. The cabin stopped being a grandpa's place. Now it became family property. Uncle Wade started visiting constantly. Sometimes he carried folders. Sometimes contracts. One evening I finally pushed back. Grandma wanted me to keep it. Mom slowly placed down her fork. She was emotional near the end, she replied. Then she added the word they used for everything. "This is business." Business. That word became their excuse for greed. By 17, Dad stopped pretending. "When you turn 18, we'll settle this together as a family." But the way he said family made my stomach knot. One afternoon while cleaning the cabin, I discovered an envelope hidden behind old quilts. My name was written on the front. Inside was a business card. Margaret Caldwell, attorney at law. Underneath her name were 4 words. Twain Family Trust. My hands started shaking. Grandma had hidden it there for me. 3 months before my 18th birthday, Margaret finally called me. "We need to talk before your birthday," she said carefully. That Saturday, I met her downtown. Her office smelled like coffee and old paper. She opened a thick folder and looked directly at me. "Your grandparents created an irrevocable trust 6 years ago," she explained. "The cabin, savings accounts, and investments were all transferred into it." I stared at her silently. "The trust is worth approximately $2.1 million, she continued. "And you are the sole beneficiary." The room suddenly felt unsteady. "The cabin legally stopped belonging to your grandparents years ago," Margaret explained. "Your father and uncle have no claim to it." "Why didn't they know?" I asked. Margaret paused. "Your grandfather told me something very specific," she said quietly. "He believed his sons would try selling the cabin before the funeral flowers died." Then she said something even worse. "Recently, someone started asking questions about the property title." After that meeting, I began paying closer attention. One Sunday evening, Uncle Wade visited for dinner. Later, he and Dad went into the garage. I stood beside the cracked door and listened. "I already signed the agreement with Ridgeline," Wade whispered. $450,000. My chest tightened. "How do we transfer ownership?" Dad asked nervously. "We'll file a quitclaim deed," Wade answered. "Mom and Dad are gone. We're the heirs." "And Iris?" "She's 17, Wade scoffed. "She can't stop us." Then he laughed. "We'll throw her 50 grand for college. She should be thankful." I stepped away from the door with freezing hands. Wade had already promised property he didn't legally own. That night, I texted Margaret. "They're moving faster now." Her reply came immediately. "I expected that." The next weekend, she explained everything clearly. "The moment you turn 18, you become the legal successor beneficiary. Once you sign the documents, I'll file the legal notice first thing in the morning. After that, nobody can touch the property." "What if they try anyway?" I asked. "They'll lose." I stared down at the paperwork. Should I tell my parents? Margaret removed her glasses slowly. Your grandfather hired me to protect you, Iris. Not negotiate with them. 9 days before my birthday, Dad suddenly announced he was throwing me a huge party. You only turn 18 once, he said with a smile. I smiled back. But I already knew the truth. Dad was planning a celebration. Uncle Wade was planning a theft. And my grandparents had already built the trap years earlier. 5 days before my birthday, Mom sat beside me on the couch. Now that you're becoming an adult, she began gently, we need to make some family decisions. The word family sounded fake now. The cabin costs money, she continued. Taxes, repairs, insurance. Selling it would help everyone. Grandma wanted me to keep it. Mom's patience cracked slightly. Sentiment doesn't pay bills. Right then, Dad walked into the room. I already spoke to a buyer, he said proudly. What company? Ridgeline. Of course it was. I'll think about it, I replied. Dad smiled proudly. That's my girl. Later that night, Kelsey entered my room quietly. Mom and Dad keep talking about the cabin, she whispered. They sound excited. Don't worry about it, I told her. But she still looked nervous. 3 days before my birthday, Wade stopped me in the driveway. The land alone is worth nearly $500,000, he said smoothly. You agree to the sale, you walk away with 50 grand. Whose name is on the deed? I asked. Your grandparents, he admitted. But they're gone. That's not how ownership works. For a brief second, his smile disappeared. Then it returned. You're overthinking this. As soon as he drove away, he immediately called someone. I already knew who. The night before my birthday, I drove to Cedar Lake alone. The lake was completely silent beneath the dark sky. I sat in Grandpa's old porch chair and opened Margaret's email. Every legal document was prepared and waiting for my signature. At midnight, I carefully read every page twice. Then I closed the laptop and listened to the water. Grandpa once told me patience wasn't weakness. It's timing, he said. That night, I finally understood what he meant. I cried quietly. Not because I felt weak. Because I wished none of this was necessary. I wished my father cared more about memories than money. I wished my mother asked what I wanted. I wished I didn't need legal protection from my own family. But wishes never win legal battles. Paperwork does. I returned home and set my alarm for 11:45 p.m. At midnight, I would turn 18. And everything would change. 11:50 p.m. The entire house slept peacefully. I joined a video call with Margaret. Ready? She asked. Ready. The clock struck midnight. I signed every document. Just like that, I officially became the legal beneficiary of the Twain Family Trust. At 8 tomorrow morning, I'll record the legal notice with the county, Margaret explained. Once that happens, nobody can sell the property. I stared at the signed pages in my hands. This isn't a trick, Margaret said gently. It's your grandparents' final gift to you. Downstairs, my family slept peacefully. They had no idea Uncle Wade's fake paperwork was already worthless. That same night, Wade printed forged documents at his apartment. At 11:30, he called Dad. Everything's ready, he said confidently. We file tomorrow morning. You sure this works? Dad asked nervously. Simple transfer between heirs. Except it wasn't simple. Wade had already signed a deal with Ridgeline Development. If he failed to provide legal ownership, he'd owe $45,000. He gambled everything on property he never actually owned. And by morning, he would discover the truth. My birthday party started at 4 in the afternoon. The living room filled with relatives, neighbors, church friends, balloons, decorations, and cake. I smiled. Opened gifts. Pretended everything was normal. But hidden inside my jacket pocket was the paperwork that changed my entire future. Dad stood beside the cake and raised his glass. Iris is officially an adult today, he announced proudly. And our family has exciting plans ahead. Then he looked directly at me. Right, Iris? Every face turned toward me. Thanks, Dad, I replied calmly. Nothing more. Later, Nora Beckett, our neighbor from Cedar Lake, quietly pulled me aside. I saw your uncle showing the property to buyers last week, she whispered. He brought men in suits. He was already selling land he didn't own. After cake was served, Dad stood again. Our family has struggled financially, he announced dramatically. But Harold and Vivian left us something valuable, the cabin. The room fell silent. And together, as a family, he continued proudly, we've decided to sell it. We've decided. The words hit me like ice water. Dad smiled toward me. Iris understands this is best for everyone. I slowly set down my fork. I never agreed to sell the cabin. Dad's smile froze. She's joking, he laughed nervously. I'm not joking. Wade stepped forward quickly. This isn't the place for this. You're right, I replied calmly. The right time is 8 tomorrow morning. Nobody understood what I meant. But Wade suddenly looked terrified. Guests began leaving shortly afterward. Once the house emptied, Mom turned toward me angrily. Do you understand what your father is going through? She snapped. And you're trying to sell Grandma's cabin, I replied. We're family, she shouted. And if you cared about family, I answered quietly, you wouldn't need to pressure me with lawyers. I froze. How do you know about a lawyer? Mom avoided answering. Instead, she admitted Wade had searched through my bag and found Margaret's business card. The room spun. They had gone through my personal belongings. Before I could respond, Nora stepped into the kitchen. That girl has every right to hire a lawyer, she said firmly. This is family business, Mom snapped. Nora didn't back down. Vivian wanted Iris protected. After Nora left, Dad shut the kitchen door. The atmosphere suddenly felt suffocating. Here's what's happening, Dad said coldly. Tomorrow morning we file the paperwork, sell the cabin, and you walk away with $50,000. Out of how much? I asked. Nobody answered. And if I refuse? Dad's face hardened. Then you're on your own. The words hurt more than I expected. You're threatening to throw me out? I'm asking you to act like family. I stood slowly. I am acting like family, I said quietly. I'm the one keeping promises. Then I walked upstairs. That night, sitting on my bed holding the trust documents, I finally understood something painful. My grandparents knew exactly what would happen long before I did. And they protected me anyway. At 8 a.m. the next morning, Margaret Caldwell became the first person inside the county recorder's office. She filed the trust documents and legal notice against the cabin property. Done. From that moment forward, anyone searching the title would discover the truth. The cabin belonged to the trust. And I was the legal beneficiary. At 8:14, Margaret called me. It's official. Meanwhile, Dad and Wade arrived at the county office carrying forged paperwork. The clerk entered the property number into her system. Then she stopped. I can't record this document, she said. Wade blinked. What? The property belongs to the Twain Family Irrevocable Trust. Dad stepped forward in disbelief. That's impossible. The records are clear, the clerk replied. Then she delivered the final blow. There's also a legal notice filed this morning. Wade's face lost all color. Dad slowly turned toward him. You said this was simple. I didn't know about the trust. You're a real estate agent. Dad exploded. How didn't you check? Margaret quietly watched everything from the waiting area. She didn't need to say a word. At 9:22, Dad called me. What did you do? I accepted what Grandma and Grandpa left me. You went behind our backs. The lawyer has been involved for 6 years, I replied calmly. You just never noticed. Silence filled the line. Finally, Dad whispered. This was my parents' property. And they trusted me to protect it. Another long silence. Not because they didn't love you, I added carefully. Because they didn't trust you with it. Dad hung up. Minutes later, Ridgeline Development called me directly. We have a signed contract from Wade Twain, their lawyer explained. He doesn't own the property, I replied. There was a long pause. Is the cabin for sale? No. That same afternoon, Margaret gave me even worse news. The notary stamp on Wade's paperwork appears fake. My stomach dropped. That's illegal, right? Yes. My uncle hadn't just tried stealing the cabin. He committed fraud. Dad came home exhausted later that afternoon. Mom looked like she'd been crying for hours. Dad sat across from me at the kitchen table. The bank is after me for $180,000, he admitted quietly. The store is failing. The cabin was supposed to save us. I'm sorry about the business, I said honestly. But the cabin was never yours. Mom immediately stepped in. Your grandparents weren't thinking clearly. They created the trust 6 years before they died, I replied. Dad slammed his fist against the table. I'll fight the trust. Then Margaret's voice came through my phone speaker. I'd already called her. Mr. Twain, she said calmly, challenging this trust would cost more than the property itself. Legally, it's airtight. Dad stared at me differently after that. Not with anger. With defeat. A few hours later, Wade called in panic. Ridgeline was suing him. They're accusing me of fraud, he whispered. Dad answered coldly. Did you commit fraud? Long silence. Then Wade admitted everything. I found a notary stamp. Dad inhaled sharply. That's forgery. I need a lawyer, Wade whispered. So do I, Dad replied before hanging up. Over the next several weeks, everything collapsed. Ridgeline sued Wade. The county launched an investigation. His real estate license was suspended. Soon the entire town knew the story. Harold Twain's sons tried selling the family cabin. His granddaughter stopped them. Some people called me brave. Others called me cruel. I didn't argue with either. One afternoon, Wade called begging. Please ask your lawyer to remove the notice. No. Your grandparents would hate this. I looked at Grandpa's photo sitting on my desk. My grandparents created the trust, I answered quietly. They expected this. Then I hung up. Eventually, Dad stopped fighting. He sold the hardware store at a loss and negotiated payments with the bank. Mom returned to work at a pharmacy. The house barely survived financially. For weeks, Dad and I hardly spoke. One evening, Kelsey called me quietly. I don't understand everything, she admitted softly. But I'm sorry they hurt you. My throat tightened. Thanks, Kelsey. In late April, I returned to the cabin alone. The trees around the lake had started blooming. I unlocked the front door using Grandpa's old key. Inside, everything smelled exactly the same. Pine wood. Old books. Warm sunlight. I slowly walked through every room. Grandpa's handmade kitchen table. Grandma's colorful bookshelves. The porch where we watched sunsets together. Then I discovered another envelope hidden inside a desk drawer. My name was written on the front in Grandpa's handwriting. Inside was a letter. He wrote that he loved his sons deeply, but they never understood the difference between something valuable and something that simply had value. Then came the line that broke me completely. I chose you because you always asked whether the roof needed repairs before asking what the property was worth. At the bottom, he wrote, "Take care of it. It protected you before you even realized you needed protection." I sat on the porch for hours after reading that letter. A week later, Margaret called again. "The legal notice can now be removed," she said. "The property title is fully secure." And Wade. He settled with Ridgeline using a personal loan. The deal is dead. Then she added one final surprise. "Your grandparents also created a separate college fund for you. $50,000. With interest, it's now over $58,000. I closed my eyes. $50,000. The exact amount Dad and Wade tried offering me to stay quiet. My grandparents had already planned everything. Carefully. Quietly. Lovingly. That fall, I enrolled in community college studying environmental science with a forestry minor. The cabin sat only 20 minutes away. For the first time in my life, I wrote the cabin's address under home address. And it finally felt true. A few days later, I asked Mom and Dad to meet me at a coffee shop. Neutral territory. Not the cabin. Not the house. Just somewhere quiet. They both looked nervous when they arrived. "I love you both," I said carefully. "But the cabin will never be sold." Mom immediately tried speaking. I stopped her gently. "You searched my belongings. You threatened to throw me out. You tried pressuring me into giving away something Grandma trusted me to protect." Dad stared down into his coffee. Finally, he whispered, "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't have to fix everything today," I answered. Then I stood up. "I'll call Sunday." It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a beginning. One Sunday in May, Kelsey visited the cabin carrying pizza. We sat together on the porch watching sunlight reflect across the lake. "I didn't know about any of it," she said quietly. "I know. Was I part of the problem?" I looked at my little sister carefully. "She never asked for any of this. You were just a kid, Kelsey." "So was I." She smiled softly while staring at the water. "It's beautiful here. Grandma used to say that too." "Can I come back sometimes?" "Anytime." That afternoon, we talked about school, the dock, and the birds standing near the shoreline. For the first time in years, things felt peaceful. Early one morning in June, I sat alone on the porch drinking coffee while fog drifted over Cedar Lake. I thought about everything that happened. I didn't beat my family. There's no victory in being betrayed by people who were supposed to protect you. But I kept my promise. And for the first time in my life, I stood somewhere that truly belonged to me. Not because I fought harder. Because two people loved me enough to prepare shelter before the storm ever arrived. My grandparents couldn't stop my father from becoming desperate. They couldn't stop Wade from chasing money. But they made sure I had solid ground beneath my feet. Grandpa was right. There's a difference between something that has value and something that is valuable. And my family spent years chasing the wrong thing. If you're listening right now and feel like nobody is protecting you, remember this. Sometimes the people who truly love you prepare quietly. Sometimes they build protection long before the storm appears. And sometimes all you need to do is keep the promise they trusted you with. That's my story. If it touched you in any way, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to see you in the next story.